Hello and welcome to the Money Marketing Podcast. In this episode, we talk about how advisors can spot vulnerability among clients, as well as what they should be doing to help clients in vulnerable circumstances. Hello, I'm Lois Vallely, Chief Reporter for Money Marketing, and on this episode of the podcast, I am joined by Hannah Coffey, who is Vulnerability and Client Assistance Manager at St James's Place, and Zoe Taylor, who is Chartered Financial Planner at Lawrence Neal Wealth Management, which is a senior partner practice of St James's Place. And Zoe was awarded Vulnerability Champion of the Year at SJP's Chartered Symposium this year. So congratulations, Zoe.
Thank you.
And hello to you both.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining me today. So perhaps you could start off just by introducing yourselves and saying a bit about how you got into financial services. So as I introduced you first, Hannah, perhaps you could start.
Sure, of course. Yeah. So I'm, of course, Hannah Coffey. I've been at St James's Place for 7 years, I think it is now. And that was my first role in financial services, and I've clearly not left. I have, however, had a couple of different roles, and I started this particular role looking at vulnerable clients and what we needed to do to make sure that our partners, the likes of Zoe, of course, were able to look after their clients in vulnerable circumstances in about December 20, ready and kind of geared up for the final release of the vulnerable consumer guidance that came out from the FCA in 2021. Mm-hmm. My role is kind of predominantly to provide, how do I sum this up, sort of coaching and development support for financial advisors so that they know, where they stand and how to support clients in vulnerable circumstances. And I do that very much on a one-to-one basis, of course, to do the coaching, etc. And in terms of education, that's to a much wider group. So I think SJP's got roughly, and don't quote me on this, about, well, you are quoting me on this, so I hope nobody tells me off, roughly 5,000, probably just shy of 5,000 partners and advisors out there. So we do a lot of online learning, like I think most companies will do, monthly, what we call vulnerability masterclasses, podcasts. We're joining you here today, but we have a podcast that I run in SJP too. And then we have, we created a new vulnerability policy in SJP that goes across the group. So, includes the likes of Rowan Dartington and our admin centre, etc. We've also, of course, got fact sheets that are really helpful in a client vulnerability circumstance that helps, the partners and advisors identify vulnerability. And what I think is really important that we're focusing on quite heavily at the moment is that point where advisors are able to draw a line and actually refer on to an external charity or an organisation that is potentially better placed to support on the emotional or physical kind of symptoms of a particular vulnerability. So that's me, I guess, from a head office point of view. And Zoe is, of course, part of our partnership. So Zoe, shall I hand over to you, and it's your turn now to see what you do?
Yeah. Well, I came in a bit of a unorthodox route, actually. So I've been with SJP for about 8 years now. Prior to that, I had a varied set of careers, really. I was in a travel agent for some time. I was management there as well. And then I had a property company where we would clean and monitor furnished holiday lets, of all the things. And while that was kind of supplementing my exams in financial services, so I quickly fell in love with it. I had to leave the travel agents when I had a baby. Their flexible working policy wasn't what we would like to do. And at that point, I went and got a job in administration for a local financial advisor. Decided I really liked this, sat all the exams, and 8 years later, here I am, a fellow, and very much loving working with clients. Kind of the at the middle age, that sort of 40 to 60 years where they're sandwiched between tons of responsibilities. They might have, parents going into care. They might have kids that are trying to get on the property ladder. They might be trying to retire themselves. So lots of responsibility, lots of change. And just generally a lot going on. So my real passion is helping these people to navigate all of life's interesting twists and turns. And to do so, it has made me really mindful that all of that additional stress and all of these unfamiliar situations, particularly long-term care, for my clients has been quite an eye-opening experience, and something that we went through personally as a family. So that has made me really passionate about sort of understanding vulnerability, working out how we can best support people, and recognizing that it's not in one straightforward area. It's not just because of your age or just because you've got a health condition. It's so multifaceted now, and we're much more aware of what goes on. So yes, that's kind of my background and what I'm trying to achieve really with these kind of podcasts. I think it's great that we can raise awareness like this.
Perfect.
Zoe, you seem to have missed a perfect opportunity there to talk about the fact that you won an award in SJP quite recently.
No, you're right. And again, it was all tied into the same work. So like a lot of financial advisors, you start getting involved in things that you're passionate in. So I started out doing the Society of Later Life Advisors accreditation, and I joined up for the Financial Vulnerability Task Force. If you haven't already, go and check that out. That's worth a look. Because I enjoyed the long-term care element and understanding all of those things that go on with that. And then personally, we had a situation in the family where my granddad went into care with quite advanced Alzheimer's. And something that previously I'd always thought was quite black and white, we're financial, black and white, tax rule kind of people, lots of us. And I thought it would be just really straightforward, you just do X, Y, Z and, the care was arranged, problem solved. But actually the attorneys were my mother-in-law and her brother, and they had very different approaches to each other, and they were struggling massively. And when it's your family and it's your emotions and, it becomes very personal, it is much harder to make these decisions that you think are black and white. So on the back of that, I did SJP, teamed up with Gloucester University to do the master's degree course, which again, if you're part of SJP and you want to look at, it is a brilliant thing to do to not only distinguish yourself from other advisors, to show you're going that extra mile, but also to show to clients that you really get it. You are academic, you understand more about what goes on in the wider world. And there I did this master's degree where it focused very much on people's decision making around long-term care. Again, totally eye-opening. So yeah, the award was such a lovely validation of all of the work that I'd done around vulnerability and vulnerable clients, and trying to better understand and make myself better as an advisor and a better human for that matter. So yeah, it was all part of this whole journey, and it's been interesting.
Yeah, no, it sounds great. So as everyone's probably gathered, we are talking about vulnerability today, primarily. So I thought maybe it might be helpful to talk a bit about what vulnerability actually means. So you already mentioned, that it's multifaceted. It doesn't just mean old age, or it doesn't just mean illness. So what are your thoughts on, the meaning of vulnerability?
Yeah, so from my point of view, from the research that we've done with the master's course, the FCA in particular in 2020, I believe, brought out a huge body of work all about vulnerability, and they taught us about the certain characteristics that we needed to consider. So things like health, which, and age and understanding, but also things like experience and capacity to absorb all of this information. So financial advisors in particular, and the financial services industry as a whole, are in such a unique position where the complexity of the financial products we offer, the potential that people can enter into like irrevocable commitments, things like immediate needs annuities or pension annuities that can't be changed later on, all combined with clients making decisions potentially, time pressured, emotional, heightened responses in the way that they think and react to things, could have massively serious and long-term impacts financially, but also, from a mental health point of view, from like a quality of care home point of view. It's so difficult making sure that people really actually are understanding, or whether their ability to understand is being hampered by something else that's going on in their world. So when you put all of this together, and when you look at the fact that it can be so multifaceted, you can have all these different areas, some of which will overlap. You could have a client that's got, a health issue combined with the fact that they have never dealt with their pension before. The statements have gone in a drawer. We all hear that quite a lot. And, and their mum and dad are going into a care home. When you pile all of that into one place, are they really in a good place to be taking on board our complex financial literature and really comprehending what these decisions mean in their life? Well, possibly not. And in the FCA's survey that I mentioned back in 2020, they identified that around 46% of adults, of our clients that we're dealing with, could be displaying at least one of these characteristics at any given time, which means that, vulnerability isn't this one-off thing that we need to be mindful of for over 80s. It is actually every day. It's in, probably half of the clients we sit in front of will have some form of vulnerable characteristic that we maybe need to be mindful of, or, documenting, or being more careful to be giving information that is likely to be received properly and understood. So yeah, it's everywhere. It's really such an important aspect of our job now.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's interesting as well, because I don't know, because I've written about other sectors as well, energy and water, and there was always a lot of talk about vulnerable customers, especially in energy, because obviously, if customers can't pay their bills, they'll get cut off from having any electricity or gas. And I always found it interesting that the low number of people who would actually self-identify as vulnerable. And so it's very difficult for, in this case, the energy and water companies to actually have any idea of how many vulnerable customers they might be serving. So I imagine it's similar in financial advice. People might not necessarily think of themselves as in vulnerable circumstances. So it's sort of on the financial advisor to recognize vulnerability in an even bigger way, I'd imagine. Hannah, did you have any thoughts on what vulnerability actually means?
Totally. I mean, so just to kind of recap, I guess, it's worthwhile kind of talking about how the FCA defined vulnerability, because of course they started this whole thing off. So they talk about a vulnerable client being someone who, due to their personal circumstances, is especially susceptible to harm, particularly when a firm is not acting with appropriate levels of care. And I think Zoe picked that up there. So, for me, what's kind of obviously really important to me working for St James's Place is that it kind of puts it back on us, doesn't it? It says, when a firm isn't acting with appropriate levels of care. So what does that mean? And how do we make sure that we do act with appropriate levels of care? And that's what Zoe really picked up on when she said, making sure that a client understands what they're getting themselves into, particularly if it's not something that can be easily undone. Now, I think, the way we operate, in the way we have partners and advisors like Zoe out seeing clients, means that we're in a really good place to make sure that clients do understand the advice they're getting. It's not kind of what we would call execution only, where it's online and you're not speaking with an advisor. But so you've also mentioned that kind of, roughly 50% of the UK population, the FCA identified as them themselves having identified characteristic of vulnerability. But, of course, none of us really like the idea of being termed vulnerable. So we probably wouldn't want to tell anybody else that we think we're vulnerable. And therefore, we often really don't want to see ourselves as vulnerable either. Now, what's quite tricky is, yes, some clients will very naturally and comfortably tell their financial advisor what's going on. But you're quite right. Financial advisors won't necessarily see that if a client doesn't want to share this information with them. And so there's a tricky line to walk, isn't there? And I guess, Zoe's probably better placed to answer this, or she'll tell us how she does it, but it's engaging with clients in the right way. So creating that transparency, that comfortable, safe space, and that really important relationship between the financial advisor themselves and the client, that means that we can talk about all of these, potential or actual characteristics of vulnerability that we might be facing. And, that those vulnerability characteristics are vast, that, from any kind of life event, what the kind of unavoidable circumstances like a bereavement, to circumstances like retiring, of course, because that's unavoidable too. Having, if you have children, them going into school and nursery and having to pay for, this, or children to be looked after while you're going to work, funding them to go to university. These kinds of things are all in the natural sort of life cycle. And then you've got, of course, health concerns, physical or mental. And then what's really important to me, I think, is resilience. So how capable you are of dealing with extra stress in your personal resilience, but also, of course, in your financial resilience and any investments that you've made with a financial advisor too.
Yeah, definitely. Zoe, I'm interested in sort of how you identify vulnerability in clients. If have you come across clients who don't necessarily want to sort of define themselves as vulnerable, but you feel they are in vulnerable circumstances?
Oh, often. Actually, yeah, it comes up more than I suppose you would. Unfortunately, in this day and age, it is everywhere, and there's a few things. We're quite lucky. We're in quite a privileged position because we go and see our clients, at least once a year, sometimes more, for people who need a bit of extra support. It is easier to tell, if there's been a change, if there's a change in demeanour, if there's a change in, in some cases, financial use, that kind of thing. If there's a change in physical possessions in the house, the better you know people, the easier it is to notice these changes, which is why going and seeing people and, being in regular contact is so important in our role. But also, there's a bit of an education piece for me. So where people maybe don't want to admit things because they feel like they're the only people in the world, going through this. Sometimes I will start a conversation that kind of is a bit of a general educational statement, and I might say things like, have you seen these new statistics about Alzheimer's and the way that they are, being treated, or something completely general that is very much to do with whatever it is that's going on in their world. It could be, there's a lot of scams going around, all of these things where you open a conversation that's not directly specific to the client, but you are very much driving at an educational point or at, making them feel safe to talk about things because you are making it known that this happens and that you can talk about it and that there are things that can be done. Education is massive, actually. And I think when there's the slightest suspicion, if you can open a conversation and you've got enough natural trust with that client, we're in such a place where we can make a big difference with the right signposting and the most, appropriate identification of things. We can really help people, which is why it has to be acknowledged, and we have to create these conversations sometimes to draw information out of people who otherwise maybe wouldn't want to tell you things.
Yeah, no, definitely. It sounds almost like therapy in a way, or not quite, but close to it.
Yeah, it certainly does. Our job is very much not just black and white financial anymore. It does involve a lot more kind of coaching and understanding, and emotional intelligence, is massive now. It's not just having the right bit of paper that says you can talk about investments. You have to be open and wanting to listen. We have to create space for people to talk and tell us things because every house is different, and the more appointments you do, the more you realise that whatever's going on in their world is just as important as whatever financial topic that you happen to be talking about. They're two halves of the same whole.
Yeah, definitely. So I know obviously we had the COVID pandemic, went on for ages, it seems like. And then following that, I've heard anecdotally that, more people are suffering with mental health issues who might not necessarily have before, or certainly it seems to have increased the recognition of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, that sort of thing. And now, we're in this cost of living crisis, which I think is just making things worse. And I just wondered, obviously that's not the only vulnerability, as we've discussed. There's lots of different definitions or different aspects of vulnerability. So we've already touched on it a little bit, but what are some of the key things that financial advisors should be doing, or some of the other key things that financial advisors should be doing to help clients in vulnerable circumstances? I don't know who wants to start.
Hannah, I'll let you take that one.
I'm taking this one, am I? Okay, no problem. So, Lois, yes, you're right. It does seem like more people are struggling with mental health than they have done previously. And I'm not clinical in any way, but, sometimes I wonder to myself, is that because more people really are struggling? Is it because more people are comfortable in sharing that they're struggling, and so it's talked about more, which I actually think can only be a good thing? But undeniably, you've gone from COVID and the COVID pandemic to, inflation issues, and I will miss bits and pieces out here, so I don't mean to belittle any kind of circumstance, but then of course you've got the issues with Ukraine and Russia. To at one point I think we were all petrified that monkeypox was going to be a thing, and that seems to have just disappeared straight into the cost of living crisis. It's not the news isn't fun particularly, and very rarely lighthearted anymore, is it? And I think that impacts people an awful lot. What can we do to help? I think for me, and Zoe will obviously have examples with specific clients, I guess, perhaps to share with us, but for me it's not making sure that you don't, as a financial advisor, in any way kind of belittle any concern. Anybody can be worried about anything. Just because it doesn't necessarily, COVID might not worry me anymore, it doesn't mean it doesn't worry my sister, say. And we're as close to like-minded individuals as you're really going to get. So no one circumstance will affect two individuals in exactly the same way. So if somebody is worried about something or wants to talk about something, make sure you give them the opportunity to do that. I think, jumping straight into finances, although that's ultimately what we're there as financial advisors, to help people with, might not be the best idea. Listen to what's worrying them, perhaps where their mind is, in the here and now, or what they're aiming for in the long-term future, and kind of really getting to understand that person, because that might ultimately help your judgment in terms of investments and how they deal with their finances, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Zoe, did you have anything to add on key things financial advisors should be doing considering the current climate we're in?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And sometimes people take you by surprise. So I went to see one of my wealthy clients. You would class her as a high worth client, I suppose. She lives very modestly, lives a very modest, comfortable life that most of us would dream of, I suppose, with plenty of assets at her disposal. And I see her regularly. I went to see her the other day. We were going for lunch. She said, "Before we go, can I just ask you something?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "What would happen if I went into a care home? Would all my money go?" And I think that fear of the unknown, actually, all these sort of variables that we can't control, outside influences, sometimes the media is not very jolly. And so, especially when you talk about things like care, etc., the rhetoric, I suppose, everyone you talk to, and the concerns in the papers and the lack of the cap, for example, all of these unknown variables that we have absolutely no control over makes people feel really uncomfortable. So for me, I think adding some tangible evidence just to either not argue, but, to show otherwise and to provide reassurance. So for her, we did some stress testing. So we plugged in our assets and we put in the worst case scenario and we worked out, the most expensive care home in the area we could find. And we were able to really tangibly demonstrate that, in pretty much any circumstance, with any market crash, with a bit of stress testing, even going into a care home and increasing their expenses, £6,000 a month and all of these other things, we could actually quantify that. No, you really have absolutely nothing to worry about. You cannot run out of money under almost any circumstance. So sometimes just by kind of facing that head on and being able to give a tangible reasoning for why that concern, although it's valid, you don't need to worry about. The reassurance is massive for clients. And I think sometimes we forget because it feels kind of obvious to us. You go, well, of course, you've got loads of money. That's not really substantial enough to make somebody feel massively better. So using all these tools we have at our disposal to forecast things, to show income, to offset inflation, to do that and give a properly quantified, evidenced answer is really reassuring. So I left that meeting and she just was like, her weight is lifted. And she said, I know I'm being silly. I can see I've been really silly. I bet you can't believe I asked you that question. And I said, well, no, it's not silly because it was real. It was real to you in the moment. And when you get yourself worked up and you feel that way, you can't help how you feel. But yeah, being able to try and quantify some of that uncertainty and give some actual, evidence-based things is really nice.
Those tools are really cool as well because, of course, they create images as well. So thinking about how different people take on information, some people might struggle just hearing it or looking at figures, whereas, like Zoe's saying, the graph will show you the ups and the downs and the nuances of all those stress testing, and actually clients being able to walk away with that. It's something to literally hold on to, isn't it? And I think that really helps a lot.
Yeah, definitely. No, I would always say imagery really helps me and to visualize something. So yeah, I can totally see. I did want to ask, actually, well, you've kind of already covered it, but obviously development is really ramping up, and I just wanted to ask how technology can help with both identifying vulnerability, but also advising clients in vulnerable circumstances. Yeah.
So if I pick up with identifying vulnerability initially, then there are quite a few tools being created in the industry that take, I guess, the ownership off the financial advisor. If the financial advisor feels it's too big a step from financial advice into a kind of clinical world in terms of identifying and almost labeling a client as vulnerable, although, as we've said, I probably wouldn't tell anybody particularly that you're calling them vulnerable. And they, most of them run kind of really super simplistically, like a decision tree. Would you remember back in the day in magazines, it would sort of, you would go down a yes, no path and you'd follow them into all of the different boxes to see, I don't know what star sign you ended up being, for example. This is, whether you're vulnerable or not vulnerable, I guess, at the end of it. And those kinds of tools are, a really good idea for financial advisors if they're struggling and they don't know what to do, how to identify vulnerability, how to record it, and ultimately, therefore, how to respond to it. And SJP have worked quite closely with two in particular, Commentis and Morgan Ash. So that might be a worthwhile thing to dig into and have a bit of a Google if you're a financial advisor who wants some technological help. In terms of actually helping clients then, and I think we've got a bit of a way to go on this, but how websites are set out, are they easy to navigate? Are online payments easy to navigate? That's obviously a huge one. Are looking at your wealth accounts online, as we call it, easy to look at, and SJP's done quite a bit of development there. Getting things like voiceovers, so technology that will read through any information that's presented online rather than somebody necessarily having to read it online, because some people might find that quite difficult with really kind of important, lengthy and technical kind of content. Is probably something to really think about. Obviously, we've talked about imagery, and that's, really cool, good thing to put in front of clients, whether you're doing that on your laptop or, I'm sure some advisors take iPads and what have you with them. Can I think of anything else? Zoe, do you have any other kind of technology bits that you use with clients? We've missed a really obvious one. What we're doing now online. You don't now have to drive 4 hours to go and see a client, do you? You can speak to them on Teams and Zoom, and I think that's a game changer for the industry. I don't think having a phone call with a client to do a full review meeting is ever the best idea, because you miss so much in people's face and how they express themselves and their movements and whether they're guarded about things. But being able to see them online now, like we are, I think is totally brilliant.
Do you know, I completely agree, actually. And I think because it feels like a real review meeting and you can read body language, being, having the tech that you can say, well, I'm still going to come and see you every year, but every quarter we'll just have a 20-minute Zoom call and we'll just have a catch up. That is just so lovely. And that regular contact, I believe, is really important anyway, because you pick up so much more. And if somebody's suddenly going to start, some of my older clients might, I'm always worried about financial abuse and these kind of things. And you do hear stories where someone's suddenly come into somebody's life and all of this, you pick up, a lot can change in a year. And if you can have more frequent, but still really meaningful, useful video conversations with clients. And age is not really a barrier. Some of my older clients are really up on tech and have iPads and, do all their shopping. And we're quite happy to have, little Zoom catch-ups where they can see you. It's much more engaging. It's much more personal. And it's, you're so much better for keeping on top of things quarterly as opposed to one random one-off meeting, where you don't really get to the bare bones of things. So yeah, tech has definitely helped, although I do think there is a lot of information online. Information, being able to really absorb and apply said information to your specific financial circumstances is really so difficult. And that's why I believe that the future of financial advice remains face-to-face. It remains people-to-people. And, as much as people talk about robo-investing and whatever, nothing replaces this for my clients. I think it's invaluable.
Yeah, definitely. No, totally agree. Just finally then, I wanted to ask what would be your main piece of advice to an advisor supporting a client in vulnerable circumstances? Maybe go Zoe first.
Yeah, I think it's all about listening, and it's about education, and it's about raising awareness and making things really normal. Being a little bit vulnerable yourself, being open to, to talking about a time where you felt a bit out of your depth in one way or another, or you felt like you had not been sort of listened to or treated fairly. If I think back, there have been times where I've been vulnerable. When I was young, I was 18, I bought my first house, and we sat with a mortgage advisor and we had absolutely no idea what we were talking about at the time. We were fresh and naive and new. And I remember clearly he said to me, what would you think if your mortgage went up? And we'd said, oh, that sounds awful. So he said, right, we're going to fix you into a fixed rate. And we went, yeah, sure. And as it turned out, we ended up with, a 5-year really sky high interest rate that we were fixed into. And, the interest rates did nothing but drop and drop. And in hindsight, I can see how he came to the decision, because he'd asked us a question, we answered a certain way, he did a certain thing. And we were quite vulnerable. We were very inexperienced. We, no idea what he was talking about most of the time. Yeah. We were too naive to ask, we didn't want to look stupid. So we just went, yeah, sure. Please give me a house. We didn't know what we were doing. And in hindsight, we were quite vulnerable. But he did his job because he gave us the product that was suitable for the answer that I gave. we didn't really understand the implications of the answer we gave, and even advice can go wrong because you haven't sort of recognised that somebody's given you an emotional answer to a financial question, and the product you have given them may not be the right product if we do sat and explained what that means. That if you have a variable rate for the first 5 years, you will pay X amount, and these are the parameters it could go up by compared to, a fixed rate at this amount, whatever.
Yeah.
We'd have had a lot more information to make an informed decision with that would have been more appropriate to our circumstances. As it turned out, we were locked into a 5-year agreement that, naive, inexperienced people didn't really understand or dare ask about. So we have all been there. And by us sharing these experiences and being a bit vulnerable, clients are much more likely to entrust you with their situations, and then you can actually help. You can add so much value. You can make their world so much better. So yes, I think if there's one thing I've learned, it's to listen and to make everything as normal and approachable and talkable as possible.
Great, perfect, thank you. Hannah, did you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I don't think being compassionate and empathetic is ever going to be a bad thing, is it? And I guess, there are some, really standardized, obvious responses. See your client more often, which Zoe's obviously already talked about, check in with them more regularly than just the sort of basic, 12-month review. If somebody's struggling to read documents because they're in a tiny size 8, arrange for them to have it, printed in a size 12 or above, something like that. It seems, simple and obvious. There are some situations that can be far more complex, and it might not be, initially really obvious to you as a financial advisor in how to support your client. And in that situation, I would say to them, either I totally understand what you're going through. I've been through something similar myself, or actually admit, I can't imagine how that's impacting you, and ask them, is there anything I can do that will make your life a little bit easier at the moment? And see what their response is. Let them lead it. They might be so, in a state of sort of panic or distress, or just have that kind of general mind fog if what they're going through is really difficult, that they don't know, but you've asked them and you've given them the opportunity. Or they might really, clearly know what they need from you to help them, but they didn't know how to bring it up, and you've opened up that conversation really easily for them.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you both so much for talking to me today. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Good. You're very welcome.
And yeah, thank you very much.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on client vulnerability. You can listen to all our other podcasts on the Money Marketing website, as well as Podbean, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Also, keep up to date with all the latest news and features on our website, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok.